Now, you were in Toronto, like the city proper, or were you a
Yes.
police officer mostly? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I was always in Toronto.
S- city policing is way different from suburban policing, obviously, because there's more people, more crime, more danger. But do you know, like, suburban um, police officers? I don't know how rural it is outside of Toronto. Is it more suburban or is it a little more spread out? Because I'm trying to get to the point of, like, the community, like the relationship of the police officers with the community. It's obviously a lot better with smaller communities because people know each other.
But
But
yeah, I mean, Toronto, you've got like the sort of city proper that's heavily
yeah,
populated. Then you have the suburbs, which is still a part of Toronto.
okay,
And then outside of that, you have smaller cities, you have towns and rural areas. And I'm born and raised in Toronto, so I don't know any different. I know community policing in the divisions I worked in worked really well in the downtown core because it was so congested. And even though you might not be dealing with the type of community with, sort of families that we expect, the community would be more of business people, right? So you have business owners and shopkeepers and things like that. So we still had a really strong sense of community.
what's the training process like? Like how long does it take for you to become a cop? What are the requirements? Either physical, mental, intellectual as well.
Well, the physical is they've changed it a bit since I came on. You still have to be able to run, and I'm not a runner. But as I've always said, when someone is sort of dangling a really cool job and pension for life in front of you, you can run 1.5 miles really fast. And so that kind of looked after that. We used to have to do push-ups and sit-ups, and now they do it where the recruits have to be able to drag things, which makes a little more sense. Because in my entire 30 years of policing, I've never, ever been asked as a job requirement to do push-ups. So I don't know what that was all about. But the whole drag test is just basically to see your general, ability to manage your body and pull stuff and things like that. They do a psychological test, and it's basically looking at, mostly your overt biases, a bit of implied biases, just to kind of weed out, any really obvious, psychopathic tendencies, things like that. And the requirement now is that you have to have academically, it is a post, you have to have, I believe, a few credits from a post-secondary school environment. So it used to be just high school, and now you have to have done, a couple of semesters at least at a post-secondary school institution, whether it's a university or a college. Now, Toronto is incredibly multicultural. That we have over 140 different mother tongues spoken in the home. So we really, really like officers with language skills because that's super important.
That. Like,
Yeah.
is French Canadian? Is French big in Canada? Is Toronto, excuse me, as well?
It's not as big in Toronto as you would think. I mean, it is our second national language, rather. But in Toronto, you've got people who are speaking Korean, people speaking Mandarin, people speaking Greek, Italian, Russian, you name it, they're speaking it. And so it becomes problematic when officers attend calls and they can't communicate with people.
Right.
So that's why we look for people with all sorts of different languages. The Toronto Police Service also really looks for candidates who will reflect the communities. So we want Muslim officers. We want officers who speak Urdu. We want women. We want people of color. We want, people that look like the people who live here.
I understand that. Now, I do want to get back to that, but first, when I think a big problem that officers have in the States is that they don't live in the communities they're policing. Right, so you have someone who could live in a expensive community or in a more expensive township, and then they're policing like a bad part of a major city, and they get this complex, whether it's mental, and they feel it's one way or the other. Does that also exist in Canada when it comes to policing, or is it kind of not mandated, but or it could be mandated? Maybe it should be mandated that if you're going to police a community, you have to actually be a part of the community and live in that community.
Well, it's really interesting you brought that up, Will, because that's been an ongoing conversation for a very long time. Because
it's very complex. Like I don't make it sound like it's a very simple solution. But yeah, please continue.
Exactly, right? Because you're thinking, if you're not part of the community, are you vested in it? Mm-hmm. Right. And that sense of, at the end of the day, you go home and, you leave all the problems of the community there and you go off to your little, sort of picket fence house. And it's really easy to sort of taint your view of the world based on where you police.
Right.
But the reality is, in Toronto, it's a very, very expensive city to live in. I believe at this time, less than 30% of all officers in Toronto live in the city itself because it's expensive.
So expensive.
Yeah. And
right. I mean,
and the flip side of that as well is that officers, after they do their 10-hour shift or 12-hour shift, they have to commute to where they live. Yep. Which could be another hour, hour and a half, 2 hours each way.
And they don't take the patrol car home. They have to take their own car.
That's right.
Right.
Right. So you're putting on, 70, 80, 90 miles on your own car each way, plus gas, plus time. And you've already done your 12-hour shift. And if you get overtime, or if you have court, if you're working a midnight shift and you have to go to court, then what do? Right. So it's a real challenge to get people, engaged in the city, engaged in the work that needs to be done. In terms of, if there's overtime or court involved, officers are saying, I don't want overtime. I've been here long enough. I just want to go home. The other issue that we have in Toronto is that officers will come here, work here for a while, realize that they're tired of commuting, 2 to 4 hours a day, and switch to a police service closer to where they live. And so we lose the officers.
And on the flip side of the argument, even if this is more applied in towns, but I know in the town I grew up in, some of the cops who did live in the town, corruption isn't the right word, but they would let things slide. Like if they picked up a group of high schoolers who were drinking underage, like at the park or whatever, they had to bust something, or drunk driving. Well, insert silly crime here. They would let it slide because they know their parents or this, that, and the other. And that's just a regular standard thing that teenagers go through. But that same principle could be applied to bigger crimes, or it's easier for them to be corrupted in those crimes. If it's like a money laundering thing within the town, it's easy to get someone on the cut when you live in the same town as you. So that is the counter argument to the community. And I think it's a valid one.
Yeah. I mean, I think, it's more the sort of the letting stuff slide because these are your neighbors.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
So, you don't
it's hard to arrest your neighbors.
Exactly. And you don't want to be standing in the grocery line, with the person that you just had a punch out with the other night and threw them in jail. And, right. So that's the flip side of that. Absolutely.